24 and there's so much more. We're alone in a paradise that makes me think of two. Love lost such a cost. Give me things that don't get lost. Like a coin that won't get tossed. Rolling home to you. Boom. Oh man, take a look at my life. I'm a lot like you. Welcome to the show, Jay Goldman. What's up, bro?
That's the best intro I've ever had.
Welcome to the Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mirshahzadeh, and we have the one, the only Mr. Jay Goldman. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, man, I'm so pumped to have you. We got the best for last and this great week we've had on the show. And we got a great guest in here, and Jay Goldman. And we're going to learn all about you and what you're up to and what you've been doing. Before we get started, guys, I want to just tell you a little bit about the show. If you're new to the show, the format's very simple. We're bringing together change makers who are living their passions to create greatness in the world around them. And let me just say this. Mr. Jay Goldman is no short of neither passion nor greatness. So we got a lot of that coming up here in the next 30 minutes. Couple of things to know about live streaming. Guys, we are live. Start a watch party. Ask us questions. I have my team on standby to shoot questions over to Jay and myself. And yeah, let's get this party started. First and foremost, guys, like I said, we have a very special guest live with us today, Mr. Jay Goldman. He is the co-founder and CEO of Sensei Labs, New York Times best-selling author of The Decoded Company. If you've not read that book, you're missing out. It is a freaking awesome book. He's an expert in data-driven digital workplace solutions, which that sounds boring, but once we talk about what it is, you will understand how freaking badass it is. And he's just an all-around stud. I love him. I love what he's doing in the world. And let's jump into it. How you doing, man?
I'm great. I am great. How are you?
You know, I don't think I could be doing any better right now, honestly. So I'm glad to have you here.
Strange time in the world, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on that's not so great. But I think if you don't even have to dig that deep to find some silver linings in it. And I got to say that for me, this has been a time of connection with people. Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that this didn't happen 10 years ago when we didn't have any of this technology. But the fact that we can get on this right now together, I can see you, you can see me, we can have this conversation. We've got our awesome microphones. We have matching microphones.
Yes. Jay gave me a full-blown tutorial. That's why I just changed my setting because I had it on Darius sing karaoke out loud setting. And which I just learned what that was because of my friend Jay here. And I moved it over to Darius talk seriously with Jay for 3 minutes. Yes, form.
Those are actually the labels on the microphone.
It's like, shut the fuck up, Darius format. Right. That's the mute button, yeah. Darius. So yeah.
But yeah, I think I feel more connected in some ways to friends and family, even though I haven't really been able to see them in person, but we've been able to connect through Zoom and Teams and spend time on video. And I think in some ways we've spent more time together than we were doing before. So yeah, I'm in a pretty good spot.
You know, it's funny that probably is, if I could only ask for one thing, it would be to be able to see my friends and family in person. You know, that is, and I would say, despite the situation, I think that I would say I couldn't be doing better, but I guess I could be doing better if I could, hug my niece and nephew and hang out with my family. But right. To your point, life's what you make of it, right? And this is a thing that the world's going through. I think that it's a blessing. I hate to say it because there's lives being lost but I think this is a blessing in disguise. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think that the world has gotten pretty narcissistic about itself. And, and we're seeing this like nationalism happening all over the world because I think people are getting so self-focused. And dude, the barn door is open, man. The cat's out of the bag. Like, we're all connected. We've always been connected, yeah. But now we're connected in like, hey, I got to make sure that the farmers show up at their jobs in like Chile to get the food, or else it's not going to end up on my plate, right? And yeah. and they got to get that food to our plate so they can like pay their workers so they can have their ecosystems, And so we're all connected, man. And I think that this is going to be a blessing in disguise, and I think it's going to show everybody that we need to start thinking like that as a more collective whole. So I'll get off my soapbox.
I do think with full recognition that there are lives being lost and that this has a tremendous impact on people, on their families, on all of those things. And that should not be overlooked. But I do think the transformation we're seeing in the world, not just around COVID and what it's doing, but, but in rethinking what the future of work looks like. Will we go back into offices the same way that we have in the past? Or will we be a lot more distributed? Will we collaborate in different ways? I think it will lead to some very creative solutions, a new generation of companies that don't look like the past generation did. I think the timing of George Floyd's murder and the protests that came as a result of that, and also decades of police brutality, but that has also had a profound reshaping effect on society. And I think it is sad when it has to start with the loss of life to get there, but also that is a powerful spark that can start the right kind of fire. And to see cities really considering defunding police departments and rethinking the allocation of those funds to social services that are desperately needed, to different approaches to community outreach. I think all of this happening at the same time is going to result in a world that maybe doesn't look that much like it did in 2019. And that's exciting in a lot of ways. It is sad, absolutely, for the loss of life that has to happen to get there. But I think it's also a tremendous opportunity to rethink some things that felt like they were unrethinkable, if that's a word, even 6 months ago.
Yeah, it's funny, like you're bringing up a couple really interesting points. And so I don't know if you know this about, well, you probably do know this about me. Like, I lost a bunch of weight, right? I don't know if you remember when we first, I don't know if you saw me when we first met. Like, I weighed about,
I think 100. We had an online chat. I don't think we had met in person then, but I think we had done a video call.
Yeah. So that, it was like fall 17. So that was right before I lost like 150 pounds. And so
that's amazing.
Yeah. It was, but the reason I bring it up isn't to brag about how amazing I look, although I do look amazing. No, it's to say that the body, and I think the mind is aligned with this, wants homeostasis. It doesn't like change. It wants to go back to the middle. It wants to just exist efficiently. And I feel like society wants that too. We don't want the pain that comes with change. Yesterday we had a fellow countrywoman of yours, Gina Mullicone Long. I don't know if you know Gina.
I don't.
Oh, I got to hook you guys up. She is amazing. I told her, if you were a character on Game of Thrones, you'd be the Red Witch. She's like a sorceress. I'm serious. I'm not totally joking that I think she's like has some magical powers. But she's up in Whistler, and she was talking about what the process of change is, and she is like, look, you have to want to change, and then you have to want to persevere through the pain to go to level up to the next level. And with, when there's pain, that's where the transformation's happening. So unfortunately, to your point, we've sat in this, we're going through this change, this metamorphosis, and not to make light of the pain that's coming with it, because there's going to be real cost, and God help anyone that's going through that's a victim of that cost. And hopefully you hope it's not you too, right? But the reality is that pain is going to motivate us to get out of homeostasis and to level up, right? Because as a collective whole, we can't keep living the way we've been living. And it's easy when you're blind to it, when you're asleep. And let's use the death of George Floyd. I know it's politicized and it's worldwide. And what I find myself saying to people a lot is, and it's funny, we're going down this rabbit hole, but I said, is it me, or is there more police brutality? And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that there's not more. I actually think there's way less. I just think that we have access to the information now.
Yeah, well, it's the pervasiveness of smartphones and cameras and I don't know the answer to the question as to whether there's more or less, but I do know that what's happened when you make everybody a citizen reporter and you've given them the tools in their pocket to be able to live broadcast at a moment's notice anything that they see around them, is you expose the things that existed because they were hidden. And create the opportunity for that change to happen, because now we can all immediately see what's happening. You can't remain hidden in the same way that you could have gotten away with things in the past. That's not just true about police brutality. It's actually just true about sort of everything that's out there.
Yeah, like I'm super pumped that you and I were kids in the 80s and 90s because I got to do tons of fucked up shit that I would never have gotten away with. I mean, like, I'm so happy this is buried and no one can find it because there's no digital artifact of the wrongdoing of my childhood. But like, it's true, man. Like, our kids are not growing up in that same world. And I can't imagine what it would be like to have your life. And when you do something, and I mean, even this show's a good example. There are certain things that if you accidentally said the wrong thing, that it's permanently inked in the digital world. You know?
Yeah. The only saving grace, I guess, of growing up now is that everybody else is also growing up now. Yes. Right. So there's a sort of mutually assured destruction of like, we're all on TikTok doing ridiculous dances. So you can't make fun of any of us for being on TikTok doing ridiculous dances. Right. You know, and the problem would have been if this had happened when, like, I was a geek growing up. I was into computers, you know, at a very early age. My dad was a software entrepreneur. So I come by this very honestly, it's almost the family business in a way. But back then that made me very unpopular for being the geek who was into computers and programming and all of those sorts of things. And so if this had happened back then, it wouldn't have been mutually assured destruction. It would only have been those of us who were into that kind of thing, which would have made it worse for us. Now it's, you know, the geeks shall inherit the earth, I guess, right? Like it has come full circle to now that's the thing to do. And so as a result of that, it's now everybody is sort of in the same boat. I have an 11-year-old daughter, and she is just coming into the age of social media for herself. Mm-hmm. And lots of conversations about how to do that in you know, not that she shouldn't participate, but that she should participate in a responsible way and understand what the possible consequences around that participation are.
Yeah, and it's funny you're saying that. First of all, yeah, like the geeks got the last laugh on that one, right? Like,
absolutely.
There's like literally like that. I mean, there was different geeks that kicked ass. Like if you were Bill Gates, you grew up in like the 50s and 60s, and then you were 20 years old in 1980, so you were way early on the spectrum. And there's a whole thing around people born in, I don't know if those Malcolm Gladwell or something around a bunch of guys born in 1954, right? Just happened to be born at the right time. I think Warren Buffett even says, I just happen to be born at the right time where my skill sets are super valued in the world, right? But yeah, if you're like us, where you were playing Atari in 1982, and we were the first generation that when we were either in our teens or 20s, the internet was coming to be. That's a really unique place to be. And especially if your father was a computer entrepreneur, it's like, yeah, dude, good. Like you lucked out on that one. You're like, yeah, I want to be. What do I want to be when I get good? Thanks, Dad. Yeah, good. Yeah. My dad owned gas stations. Didn't quite. It didn't translate quite so well. Maybe it's all my shit talking. This will turn into something because I learned that from watching you, Dad. But yeah, no, it's interesting that the kids now, to your point, I haven't had that conversation with my kids yet because they're not allowed on it. And I have a 10-year-old and he'll be 7 next week. But I'm like, I don't think I want them to have phones till they're like 14. And everyone's like, yo, you're not, that's not going to work when they're in junior high. And I'm like, well, I'll deal with it when I have to deal with it. And I don't have to deal with it yet. But what I think is interesting is, and this is where I kind of look at values, right? Part of this is a values statement. And part of this is just like, it's like an education statement. Like you have the birds and the bees talk with your kids. You have to talk about drugs with your kids. You're going to have to talk around, hey, like, don't do stupid shit on social media that you are going to regret the rest of your life. And I'm going to give you examples of what these are. Right. And you have to, like, that's a conversation none of us had to have, Well,
it didn't exist. But, at the same time, though, I think there were really important conversations that our parents didn't have with us either. And there are things that are sort of like adulting life skills. Like, I don't know if your parents ever sat you down and taught you how to budget money, or, how to have open communication with your partner in a relationship. These were just things that nobody ever taught, right? But think about how much better the world would be if you revisited the curriculum even at an elementary school level, and actually in the province of Ontario, because I live in Toronto, and so Toronto's in the province of Ontario, has just revised its math curriculum, and one of the things that they've added to it is personal budgeting skills.
Nice.
So at an elementary school level, they'll be teaching budgeting in schools, and I think these are such critical life skills that were sort of just assumed, like you'd figure this stuff out because we figured this stuff out, now I think these are things that should be taught in school. And I think social media should be taught as how to do this in a safe way. It's not that you shouldn't participate. It's that you should participate knowing what the consequences could be, what the side effects could be if you don't, if you're not aware of them.
It's funny though. I don't know if they did this in Canada, but they do it in the States. Like they did sex ed when we were 14 years old, right? So we had a class, sexual education. And the guy that taught my sex ed class was a 70-year-old football coach. And there's
Right.
something about a 70-year-old football coach talking about getting scabies and syphilis.
Yeah.
That's just like, I'm a 40-year-old guy, and I just laughed because I remember him saying it. And me and my buddies are like mimicking our football coach, talking about, keeping our peckers clean and shit like that. And I'm like,
Right.
Oh, it gets embarrassing to have that.
But it was almost the wrong form of sex. Like it was sex ed by fear, right? It was
right.
Don't do this stuff because you'll get sick. It wasn't all the actually really important part about sex ed. And I think the danger in what's happened with the wide availability of porn on the internet. I don't know if you know this, Darius, but there's a lot of porn on the internet.
I'm going to tell you this. I was an early adopter of porn. Back when it was still just on TV, so you don't need to teach me anything.
So I think though, what's scary about it is the kids whose primary form of sex ed is porn.
Oh yeah.
Are growing up thinking that what you see in porn is the way that people have sex. And there's a real lack of intimacy there, because that's not what porn is about, or at least what most porn is. I mean, there is certainly, some that is, but most porn isn't about that. So kids are finding this stuff online. They're watching it. This is their primary form of sex ed. And then they're going into relationships and they're recreating what they've seen in porn. And it's a very different world than, not having grown up that way.
Yeah. The porn back in the 90s was way more sensual than this freaking
Yeah. Wow. This conversation's gone down a really weird rabbit hole.
Hey, listen, I make no promises when I start my show. I used to work at a video store, and I used to collect porn for me and my buddies, and hand it up. And this is a story for another time, but yeah, no, it is interesting. And this puts more responsibility on parents to be advocates for their kids in these different areas, because I don't want my kids learning about sexual intimacy, watching freaking kink. I mean, that's for, you need to have a mature mind for that type of stuff. And that's where, we start looking at other areas. It's funny you brought this up. I brought this up on a show a couple of weeks ago, on our second show with a good friend of mine, Doug Irwin, where I said, I got into meditation last year, and I try to meditate every day for at least 20 minutes. So I said, no one taught me mindfulness. No one.
Yeah, not exactly.
Right. I don't know. There's a guy, Don DePani. I don't know if you know him. He's a pretty popular speaker in the entrepreneurial circles. If not, you guys should consider bringing him into Sensei and Click. He's amazing. He's a Hindi monk, right? And he teaches on distraction. He's like, no one ever taught me how to not be distracted. And in this world, the kids are being distracted 24/7.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these are life skills. We're taught the things that aren't as important, the things you can go look up on Google, like taking a class on. And that's not to say history is not important, but life skills are important, to your point.
Yeah. I also have taken up meditation and also aim for 20 minutes a day. And for me, and I think I'm 85 days into that streak or something. And it's been, I hesitate to use the words life-changing because I think it's a very overplayed term, but I actually do think it is life-changing, especially it builds up. So the longer that you do it and the more consistently that you do it, the bigger effect that it has on your life. And even just I was meditating yesterday and I was tired and my brain was a bit scattered, and I find practicing on those days harder because it's harder to channel your thoughts. But actually that's sort of the point. The point is that sometimes it's harder and sometimes it's harder to stay focused, but the exercise is still worth doing. And it's the importance of doing it. The days where you sit down and you just very calmly focus for 20 minutes aren't actually the days where you're learning anything.
Yeah, my meditations sound way more like the latter almost every day, which is I'm totally scattered. I'm all over the place. I remember I'm meditating about 7 minutes later and I go back to center.
Yeah.
And that's literally almost every one of my meditations. So I'm not great at meditating, but for me, what was game changing was when I accepted that that's the
Right.
that is actually
exactly.
the point.
But I was going to say that the not great at meditating is a value judgment about your ability to do it. And that's not actually the point at all, right?
No.
It's nobody is good or bad at meditating. It's that you do it, that you're consistent, that you put the time into the practice. And I find I take more out of the days where, in a way, I take more out of the days where I'm scattered, because what you're really training your brain to do is to be able to find that calmness in other moments of your life. So the skill is getting back to center when you're distracted. It's not the sitting in lotus position, making an noise for 20 minutes. Like that's not the skill.
Yeah. And I love that, man. And I couldn't agree more that it's about, for me, to your point, it's become the practice of awareness. And that's, and just having that skill where I'm like, oh, I'm not present. It's just like, I just have that awareness now. I'm not present. And that's a problem. Right. And then I say, oh, like before I was just I was just kind of asleep and I would just not be present. And that was that. But now it's like, hey man, like if you're going to say you're going to be present, be present. And just that millisecond of awareness makes such a world of difference. Hey, I want to go to the group. Hey guys, if you have questions, I know we've been all over the place talking about some really fun stuff, but I want to dive into a couple things. Number one, the book and really, Jay here had a New York Times bestselling book, The Decoded Company. But yeah, we got a question that just came across. You guys pump your questions in, because what I tend to do is kind of let them build up and then we pound through them. And because, as you know, I like to talk a lot and get off on tangents. So I have no promises that I'll get to your questions if you don't ask them sooner. First question though is, what do you find is the best way to get back to center while meditating?
So I think it differs by person. And a lot of work around breath, because it's a physical sensation, it's something you can anchor yourself to. But I find for myself that just focusing on the breath works for a brief period of time, and then my brain comes up with other things to distract me with. And so I've found it really helpful to do there's a few different varieties of it, but effectively paying attention to the breath as a sensation, but also paying attention to it with your mind. And you can do that. The easiest one is just as you're breathing in to think in, and as you're breathing out to think out. If you find that that's not enough, you can repeat in. So in, out, 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 out. Counting is also very effective. And so you can just count the breaths. Some people find it just back and forth, 1 on in, 2 on out, 1 on in, 2 on out. I find that's not enough, but if I keep counting, so in is 1, out is 2, in is 3, out. You can, the fact that you have to pay attention to what the count is at is also really helpful in centering. If the way that you're sitting on a particular day, there's a particular physical sensation to that, I find depends on where I'm sitting. Sometimes the back of the chair is more present because of the shape of the chair. Just focusing on the feeling of that is enough to get you recentered. But I think also the biggest thing is not having a value judgment of yourself when you get distracted, because that's where the frustration comes in. If you feel like you're failing at meditation because you got distracted, if you get angry at yourself or frustrated about it, you won't be able to be effective in your practice. It is impossible to not get distracted. It doesn't matter how long you've been meditating for. You will never achieve a state, even after 20 years of meditation, where your brain doesn't come up with distracting thoughts. That's what your brain's job is. So give yourself a break about that. A good friend of mine, Peter Flashner, who's been meditating longer than I have, always described it to me as, imagine you're training a puppy and the puppy keeps wandering away. And so you just keep picking the puppy up and bringing it back to the place where you want it to be, but without a value. It is a puppy. It will wander away. So just keep bringing it back to where you want the puppy to be. And I think that, to me, accepting that that is the state of meditation, you're never going to achieve this blissful, never get distracted state. It doesn't exist.
I'm fully convinced I have a head full of puppies right now.
I mean, there's way worse things you could have a head full of. Puppies is not bad at all.
Yeah, my puppies are fucking crazy. So that's really good. What apps do you like to use?
So I started off with Waking Up with Sam Harris.
Yeah.
And I know Sam doesn't resonate for everybody, but he really, really worked for me. It was amazing. I started if you do Waking Up, there's a 50-day course. You don't have to do it consecutively. I certainly didn't, but you need to get through the 50 days to kind of unlock the daily meditation with Sam. That 50 days was a big change for me in my life, and I recommend it. The default daily meditation in the app is 10 minutes. You can change that to 20 minutes in the setting. I suggest that you do it when you're ready to do that. It's the same meditation. They basically just extend the silence parts out.
Right.
So you get to 20 minutes. I have recently been trying Calm, and I quite like it. I like the daily Calm meditation. It's about 10 minutes. And then there's a whole bunch, there's a whole catalog of other things you can go and do. I've been doing walking meditations, and there's a nice 20-minute walking meditation in the Calm app. So if you've got, you're not worried about getting hit by a car, not that you're walking with your eyes closed, don't walk with your eyes closed, but like you want to be able to just sort of focus. So in my neighborhood in Toronto, there's a lot of laneway parking between houses. And so you can kind of walk through the laneways uninterrupted. And so walking meditation is a really nice way to get some motion into the practice. But yeah, I mean, and I think the point is, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You can find meditations on YouTube. You can also just set a timer for 20 minutes and just sit. That's not the point. The point is that you're doing it, not that it matters which app you're using or who you're listening to.
I will say though, and so I'm like top 5 list of people I want to have dinner with. Sam Harris is on it. Winston, we talked about this last night. One of the guests, Winston Churchill's number 1.
That's going to be tricky.
If I could go in a time machine, but without the time machine, top 5 living people. Oh, Sam Harris, man. I watched him on Joe Rogan the other day. That Waking Up course. I was on the far end of the spectrum. The listeners know this because I say this often. I would joke. There's 2 things in my life I hate: walking or meditation and hiking. Still hate hiking, but I mean, like I was like an avid hater of meditation, and I did what you did. I did the 50-day course. It took me 6 months to do the first 5 days. And then I pounded the next 45 days out, 45 days in a row. But literally that 5th course was 6 months after I did the first 4.
Right. Yeah.
And it like, again, with the hopes of not sounding cliche, has transformed and changed my life. And I was like a guy that couldn't sit still for 3 minutes, 2 minutes. And now I'm like, sometimes I do the 20-minute course twice in a row when I'm showing up to it. Because I just like feel so amazing when I'm done, and it's a good way to like to your point. We could go on and on about meditation, but I want to talk. Here we are, 30 minutes in. I want to talk about your book, and I want to talk about Sensei. So you guys wrote this book a few years ago. I actually read your book with my head of people before I met you, before I became a client of yours, and now we know each other outside of all that. But yeah, how do you get it in your head? You're like, I'm going to write a book and it's going to become a New York Times bestseller. Like, tell our audience about that.
The New York Times bestseller part was a very happy accident. We didn't set out with that as a goal in mind. It was something that happened. And I think it happened because we were extremely lucky in the moment in time where we published that book. So for people not familiar with it, Decoded Company is really about how you use technology and data to build more talent-centric workplaces. And the deceptively simple question that we ask, it's right on the cover of the book, is what would happen if you knew more about your talent than you know about your customers? And we all expend a huge amount of effort to understand our customers. Doesn't matter what industry you're in. You want to know their buying habits. You want to know their patterns. You use technology to understand that. There's a huge wealth of technology out there, particularly if you're in the digital space, for understanding those things. Think about what happens on an e-commerce site to follow what people are putting in carts or not, or the analytics around it, and the full pipeline of advertising and media that led you there, and what worked and what the conversion rates were. We have all of that technology outside of our businesses. and we apply almost none of it inside of our businesses to understand our talent. But the leverage effect of enabling your talent to be better at their jobs is so much greater than increasing the basket size of the average e-commerce transaction. And so we set out to write a book about what happens if you apply all of that technology inside your company. And we wrote it about our own experience building a company called Click Health, which is the parent company of Sensei Labs, and the platform that Click's been building now for over 20 years internally, which is called Genome at Click. And what a transformative effect that had on the business, on understanding the work that's happening and where it's getting held up and what engages people and what makes them happy and what makes them more effective in their jobs. And so we really wrote the book to tell that story. We were conscious of not wanting to just talk about ourselves and to tell a story about ourselves. We've been very successful. Click has grown 30 to 40% year over year for 23 years. It was 130 people when I joined 10 years ago. It's 1,100 people today. So very successful business. It is I guess maybe for lack of a better term, a commercialization partner for life science companies, help biotech and pharma companies to bring life-saving therapies to market. That's what Click does. But that's almost incidental to how it does it. And the book was really the story of how it does it. We wrote the book because as you build a company that grows at that sort of success rate, people keep telling you that was really great, but you won't be able to do it next year because the way that the math works to continue to grow at 30 to 40% year over year, the numbers get bigger and bigger. So you have to achieve more growth every year if you're going to continue on that same pace. And so it's easy enough when you're small to grow at that rate. It's much harder as the company gets bigger. And so we kept doing it and people kept telling us we wouldn't be able to do it again. And then we kept doing it. And so part of why we wrote the book was to tell that story. How are we able to achieve that kind of growth rate? The real impetus behind it was we want to tell the story of the culture of Click in a way that will attract people to come and work for the company. And right. So if we're successful in sharing that, particularly in the agency space, and Click is really at its core a marketing agency, the agency space is not a great place to work, particularly if you work for the large holdcos. They are not all that invested in culture, despite what they may say externally. Their model is to hire lots of students straight out of school, work them 70-hour weeks until they burn out, and then just replace them with more students fresh out of school. And that's not a great place to work. It was sort of accepted as the industry standard. And so we wrote Decoded to tell the story about how this could be different. And our intent was to put a book out there that would attract lots of the best talent in the industry to come and work for us. That part didn't really pan out. Our hypothesis was not maybe proven out in the end. It turns out people don't really read books before they come for job interviews all that often. So we did get some hires from it, but what happened, the lucky accident of this is we published a book in February 2014 that was really about two things: big data and building talent-centric, culture-rich organizations. And we happened to publish it at the exact moment where big data and culture were two extremely hot topics and trends. And our book sat at the exact intersection of those two things. And so to our great surprise, it became a New York Times bestseller. That unlocked an opportunity for us to speak all over the world. We went on this amazing speaking tour. So there were 4 authors of the book. Liram Siegel and Aaron Goldstein are the 2 co-founders of Click, and then myself. And then we brought in a very close friend of mine, Rahaf Harfouche. Rahaf is an amazing researcher. She worked with Don Tapscott on a number of his books. When we brought her in, she was just finishing a term at the World Economic Forum, working with them on understanding technology pioneers around the world. And so she came in and helped us to write the book and to do a lot of the research into it. The speaking opportunity that we had, no matter where we went in the world, and whether we were speaking as guest lecturers at Harvard, at NASA, on TED stages, at Google offices all over the world, wherever we were speaking, when we came off stage, there was always a lineup of people who wanted to know where they could buy the software. And so, we're entrepreneurs. It didn't take us very long to look at each other and say, hey, wait a minute, there is some unmet market need here for a platform that does this. We have a platform that does it at Click. Could we be successful in doing this externally? And so in early 2015, we started Sensei Labs really as an experiment on the side of Click. It wasn't even a separate company. It was just sort of a division. I took it on along with my Click responsibilities as part of the senior leadership team there. And we just started an experiment. And we sort of signed up our first customer to see what would happen if we offered this externally. That proved successful. We signed up a few more customers, and it just kind of built from there.
Yeah. Well, I ended up being a customer, so
You did, yeah.
yeah, worked out pretty well. Yeah, if you guys in the book, I mentioned that we have a system that we use called Unicornopolis, which essentially it's the Sensei Labs system that we white labeled our system, Unicornopolis, and it's I look at it. What's interesting is I think of technology like this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I think that technology takes something good that's happening in the analog world and makes it and automates it essentially, right? And some of the things you can't do, like data, taking big data, and unless you have a place to compile it, which obviously software does that. But I think if you take a system like like Sensei Labs, and you put it on top of a company that's maybe not that culture centric, I don't think they're going to get the same ROI that you guys got.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
You need an environment that's receptive to it. And I think to go into a very traditional hierarchical organization, lots of command and control, hierarchy and infrastructure, and then putting in a system like that would be less effective. Now, we have, since we work together, have sort of pivoted the business a little bit into a particular area of the platform called Conductor. And Conductor was really built around how you manage large scale projects. So think sort of transformation or procurement operations for a global procurement team, large scale M&A transactions, those sorts of things. And so we now work with some of the biggest companies in the world, sort of Fortune 1000, 2000 kind of scale. And we help them to deliver their most critical projects. We have a global partnership with a number of different partners like Kearney, or AT Kearney as they used to be known, who are now using this as their delivery platform. And so they're delivering their large scale consulting all over the world on the platform and using Conductor as the sort of engine for that. So we've gone a little bit away from where Sensei really started, focused around the culture piece. And it still is a culture piece about the culture of delivering these large scale projects and how you make them successful, how you automate a lot of the status tracking and reporting that would go into these. Typically on projects of this scale, about 25% of the work effort just gets lost to status reporting. And so we're able to automate that down to maybe 5 to 10% of that work effort. And the cultural piece of that is status reporting is the work that everybody hates. It's the mundane, boring, preparing PowerPoint decks and Excel spreadsheets. And so we can automate a ton of that work. It makes people much happier. They get to work on higher value work. Their engagement level goes up. They produce better results. And so, yeah, to your point, we're automating something that was happening anyway, but we can do it through the use of technology.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. But I think that what the magic that I see, and I got the honor of getting to spend time in your guys' offices and checking it out up in Toronto. And it was I don't know if you guys open that up to people or not, but it's like going to going to Zappos. Like I went to Zappos and Tony Hsieh actually endorsed the book. You endorsed the book. Thank you for that, by the way.
My pleasure. Absolutely.
You guys, you're in good company. I got a couple of New York Times bestselling authors saying I wrote a good book. But yeah, you go to these places like a Zappos or like a Sensei Labs /Click, and you could just see it, man. And what the one thing I say is it's kind of like when you're like you go through something super stressful, and then whatever the finality of that is, there's this moment where it's just like a deep breath out, where you're like, huh. I notice in good organizations, everyone is walking around more or less with that demeanor to them, with that deep breath out, and they seem relaxed and they seem like they're ready to get stuff done, right? And I think that when you have that stress, and that's not to say that stress doesn't happen. But I think there's two types of stress. I think there's like, hey, I got to get to somewhere by 1 o'clock stress, which is just like moment, like in the moment, in the day.
Yeah.
And then there's like real environmental, your body is tight stress. Yeah. And I feel like these, command and control hierarchical systems, and in some environments that is important, like military or, firefighters or stuff like that. You kind of have to have that when you're on the job because
you do. Yeah. Although they are moving away increasingly from the very strict top-down command and control of the past. It's not, I don't think it'll ever go away. Absolutely. In those situations is important, but but even the military is starting to look at how do we equip the sort of edge of the network that's closest to the conflict to make decisions in real time, because they have actually access to the best data.
Right.
And so within a framework, within a decision rights framework, certain things they can decide, certain things they can't. And I think you can apply that within a company as well. You've been a CEO. Do you want to have to make every decision that your team has to make? No. And in fact, you're not the best person to make that decision. As you move up the leadership chain in an organization, you realize people come to you with a problem. They already know what the right answer to the problem is 90% of the time. And in order for you to make that decision, you need to get them to give you lots of information so that you now have the same context that they have to agree with the decision that they would have made anyway. And so as long as those are not regrettable decisions, especially if they're reversible decisions, they should just make those decisions, because if the small percentage of the time where they make the wrong one, you can just reverse it and back out of it. It's really only the irreversible decisions that need that higher up approval, because they may lack some of the bigger picture context that they may be able to apply to that.
How do you, so I'm going to throw you a curveball then. Like, what are your thoughts on like the idea around holacracy?
I think Holacracy is a very interesting prospect. Zappos is probably one of the best examples of a holacratic company having implemented it. My take on sort of best practices, if you want to think of it as a collection of best practices, is that they almost never work in your organization the same way that they work in other people's.
Totally.
And so to pick a book up off the shelf and say, okay, this is the leadership philosophy that we're going to follow, that leadership philosophy was developed by people. First of all, by the time you get to that book, it's probably 10 years old, because they started small experiments in their company and then they ramped them up, and then they had to get to success. Then they had to write about them. And so you're getting something that really is probably a decade old in its thinking by the time you even get to it. And then to pick it up and say, okay, we're just going to wholesale implement this inside of our organization is never going to work, because your organization, whether it's a corporation or a nonprofit or, whatever it is never going to be the same as the one that they had implemented that in before. So I think to pick something up and just wholesale implement it is a bad idea, but to learn from those things, absolutely. And if I look at Holacracy, which for anyone who's not familiar with it, is a system of decision rights and frameworks around how to make decisions and distributing the responsibility for things within an organization. There are parts of Holacracy that I think would work in most organizations, and you could take those, but they often require a big rethink in the way that you approach things. So as an example, there's a concept in there of roles, not souls. And the idea is that when we tend to think about it, the people in our organizations today, you tend to think of the person who has the job. So that's the soul, rather than the roles that job may represent. And if you break down any given person in your organization, they probably have a job title on their business card. Think of your CFO, right? So your CFO has obviously chief financial officer on their business card, but the actual set of roles that person plays in your organization probably don't fit under the headline chief financial officer, right? She may be responsible for a whole bunch of things that are just happen to have come along with her particular experience or the years that she's been in the organization or whatever it is. And so breaking down the job titles into a collection of roles, documenting those roles to say, I may be the role holder of 5 different roles, and those roles have certain decision rights that come along with them. And I've been granted those decision rights by being the named role holder for that. You start to break down the traditional org chart. You get away from that top-down system, which, by the way, if you don't know the history of org charts, actually came out of railroads. The original org charts were literally a representation of the rail lines in the organization, because as you went from the Grand Central station down trunk lines, you had station managers all the way down the lines. And when you branched off to another line, you had line managers down that line. And so if you drew all of that, you got a top-down org chart of the railroad.
Wow.
And we are still doing exactly the same thing 150 years later or whatever it is today. So when you get into the definition of roles, you move away from that org chart drawing into Darius has certain roles that he holds. As the holder of those roles, he has certain decision rights and responsibilities. And as long as he holds those roles, he will have those decision rights. It also gives you the flexibility to say, hey, Darius, something new has come up. I'd like to give you a new role to hold. What can we take off of your plate? Okay, we're going to transfer that role to somebody else. Now they're the decision right maker on that role. I like that structure, but think how radically different that is than every organization on the planet today who's not implemented something like that. And to go into those organizations and implement it, I had a conversation actually with somebody who was fairly senior at Zappos about their experience of Holacracy and implementing it. And she described it as a J curve of adoption, which is to say that when you start implementing a system like that, you get way less productive. So you start and you go down the J. Now, if you're successful at it, you come way up above where you started, but you have to be willing to put that work in where you're going to lose a bunch of productivity in the bottom of the J. It's not just we're going to start implementing this and it's going to be totally up and to the right.
You know, it's what's funny is when you think of like economic slowdowns, I always say the best time to make your tough changes. I mean, outside of you know, you don't want to do something to screw with your revenue necessarily, but if you're going to have, if you have extra time on your hands because business is slow, maybe that's the time to try. I've always experimented with the tough things when we had extra time on our hands. And so that might be an interesting thing to do if we are in a recession right now. Besides, you know, you want to trim the fat if you have to, but yeah, anyway.
Yeah. You have people on your team with time on their hands, and time on their hands is a really dangerous thing. It makes people, first of all, it makes people very insecure about their job and whether they're going to continue to have it afterwards. So if you had some big projects that you wanted to do and you were never able to find the bandwidth to do it, give it to your people right now, because it will help them to feel more secure in the fact that they're going to remain employed. Yeah. And it makes them productive in a time where being productive is a really important thing. Also, those big projects tend by their nature generally to require lots of asynchronous focus time, thinking through things and planning. And then the meetings tend to be internal because you're doing sort of rethinking internally. That's often easier for people to accommodate in a schedule where they may have their kids at home for the summer with nothing for the kids to do, rather than external meetings where they have to meet with customers on the customer sort of business hours. So yeah, I think it's a great time to do those things. I look at times like this as, how do we come out of this 10 times stronger than we went into it? How do we use this time to internally focus on that? I think trim the fat is an applicable statement, not just financially. So look at your processes, right? How can your processes be exponentially more efficient than they were before? You never had the time to go back and rethink them and refactor them before because you were full tilt, all out, just running those processes. Now you've got people who are sitting around, you've got time to give them to go and rethink those things. It's a perfect time to make those things exponentially more efficient than they were before, to assess the platforms that you're using within the organization, to make some decisions about evaluating new ones or looking for those companies out there that are platform providers, and we're one of them. We would love to sign new customers up during this time. And although our business has actually been largely unaffected by this time, thankfully, we happen to sell the kind of enterprise collaboration software that is in high demand at the moment. But lots of those other companies, that's not true right now. And so this would be a great time to go to them and get good prices, because they are looking for customers to sign up. You can negotiate a much better agreement now, particularly if you're willing to take a multi-year subscription from them. So I think this is a great time to go back and rethink all of those things.
Yeah, that's such great advice. Thank you so much for that. Look, we're running into the end of our time here, but I just wanted to ask one last question, and then we'll get everyone on their way and get into the weekend. But if you had to give your 10-year-old self advice based on what you know today, you know, like we were talking about back when you were the little nerd tech kid, like knowing what you know today after all your experience doing all these amazing things, you know, in your career, all the way from, we didn't even get into your IBM and all these other things you've done, but what's the one piece of advice you give yourself?
Yeah. So I have an 11-year-old. So, you know, I think about often what's the advice that I should be giving her. And I think the problem is that you would never have listened to yourself. So, you know, I think even if you had the time machine and you could go back, like some of this stuff, I think about all the wisdom I've accumulated with my years on this planet. And I wish I could go back and give it to, but I wouldn't have listened. You have to go through some of this stuff to take it away. But let's imagine for a moment that I actually could go back and give myself some advice. I think there's two things. The one thing is, and this will sound harsh, people think about you way less than you think that they think about you. So we spend so much of our time worried about what other people think about us. And the truth is, they are thinking about themselves. They are
Right.
not actually thinking about you. So worry so much less about what people care, because they actually don't care as much as you think that they do. And this came from Mark Manson's excellent book. If you haven't read it, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, I highly recommend it. In the book, he talks about how, actually, I can't remember if this was in the book or something that he's written about afterwards, but he talks about how we judge other people by the standards we judge ourselves by. So what that means is the things that you are most hung up about yourself is how you judge other people, and you assume that they're judging you that way, but they're not. They're judging you by the things that they're most hung up on about themselves. And so you have to change your whole way of looking at how people evaluate you, because they're not using the same lens that you think that they are. And the things you beat yourself up on and are your harshest critic about, they could care less about. So that's the one thing I would say. The other thing is, I just came across this the other day. It was actually in a meditation in the Calm app, and it so resonated with me. Today is the tomorrow that you worried about yesterday.
Wow.
Right? So just, we started this conversation off by saying we're in a great place. I couldn't be better. I'm so happy. That's what today is usually like, but it's not how it felt yesterday when you were worried about it. Right. So all that anxiety that you put into this potential future state, that's what anxiety is, right? Anxiety is worry about the future. Generally speaking, depression is hanging on to the past, and anxiety is worry about the future. And all that anxiety you're putting into it is a completely wasted effort, because first of all, you can't control what's going to happen anyway. So none of us could have predicted COVID. None of us have any control over the situation. So there's no value to that energy you're putting into the anxiety about the future, because you can't actually control what's going to happen. The only thing you actually have control over is your reaction to it in the moment. This is where the meditation comes back into our conversation, because what you learn through that practice of meditation, and I wish that there was a shortcut to it, but there isn't. Spend the time every day. You will get to a point where what you actually gain is the control of your reaction in the moment. And that's actually the only thing you have control over anyway. So all that anxiety that you put into worrying about the future, just remember that you worried about today, yesterday, and today's pretty good, which means tomorrow's going to be pretty good too when you look at it through that lens. So let go of all that anxiety and really focus on now and on the value that you get out of it. I would recommend the book, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. If you haven't read it, I think for me, and speaking personally, there are parts of the book that I kind of skimmed through. It gets a little bit new agey, woo energy for me. That's a personal thing. Some people love that part. But what I really took away from that book is that concept that the only thing you can control is this exact moment. It's actually the only moment that exists. Everything in the past is gone, and everything in the future hasn't happened yet. So if you can focus on now, and you can really focus on being able to react and be present in the moment, and I don't mean that in a new agey way. I mean, literally pay attention to what's happening right in front of you. Find ways to turn down all that chatter in your brain, all that immediate emotional response that are limbic systems that are left over from hearing a rustle in the bush and reacting to whether it's a tiger about to eat you or not, which we still have built into our physiology, and still react to that rustle in the bush as though it were a tiger and trigger that fight and flight response. So we're talking real biopsychology here. Mastering the response of that, which is what you do actually get through meditation. And there's some good scientific brain structure studies that say that meditation repeatedly over time starts to change the structure of your brain. Right. If you can get to that, the anxiety goes away. And that for most people is such a relief for them in their lives. So that was a very long answer to your question of what I would tell my 10-year-old self. But to sum it up, the two things are: people don't think about you nearly as much as you think they do. So don't worry what they think of you, because they're actually in their own heads just thinking about what you think about them. And today is the tomorrow that you worried about yesterday. Let go, find ways to let go of that anxiety and really focus and live in the present, because it is how you will have the biggest impact on your life and your success.
And that right there is the whole reason why I call this show The Greatness Machine. No joke. Seriously, man. Dude, my heart is filled with gratitude for having you as a guest today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Jay,
I'm glad I could be part of the Greatness Machine.
Yeah, and you're gonna be on again. I don't even care if you say no. I'm gonna ask you again.
You're just gonna stalk me.
Yeah, I'm just gonna be like, hey, bro, you need to sign up. I need to get motivated. I don't care about my audience. I care about myself right now. And
listen, I'm happy to do this again. Happy.
Yeah, this was really fun,
man.
man.
To twist my arm.
Well, you guys have a great weekend. Thank you, Jay, again so much. This is so awesome. And you guys check us out at The Real Darius M on Facebook. You can sign up on my website for more updates on. We got a bunch of shows next week too. And that's at www.therealdarius.com. Thank you guys so much. Out. Oh, we're still on.